Snow fell soft over the empty streets of Dry Creek that Christmas night. Most folks were warm behind locked doors, but not the girl sitting by the livery stable, wrapped in rags, her lips blue from the cold. She didn't look up when the sound of hooves stopped beside her. A man in a fine coat dismounted, brushing snow from his hat. "You'll freeze out here," he said, voice low but kind. She shook her head. "Got nowhere else to go, sir." The cowboy paused, studying her trembling hands, then took off his glove and held it out. "Then you come with me." That night, the richest man in town gave more than money. He gave her back her hope. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The fire crackled and popped as the storm outside deepened, rattling the shutters like a restless ghost. Daniel McCrae leaned back in his chair, the light of the flames tracing the edges of his weathered face, the lines of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. Lila sat curled beneath the blanket, steam rising from the bowl of broth cupped between her small hands. She stared into the fire as if afraid it might fade if she blinked. Daniel watched her in silence, seeing in her the same hollow look he'd carried years ago, after the mines took his brother and the war took his peace. "You been out there long?" he asked, voice low, almost unsure. She hesitated, the spoon pausing at her lips before she whispered. 3 days, maybe 4. The last place I stayed, the man wanted things I couldn't give. So I ran. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he poured himself a measure of whiskey, took a slow sip, and let the warmth burn through the chill that had settled in the room. Outside, the wind moaned like a wounded thing. "Ain't safe for a girl to be wanderin' alone in weather like this," he said at last. She looked up then, her eyes wide and too old for her face. "Wasn't safe where I was, either." That truth hung heavy in the air. Daniel set his glass down, stood, and crossed the room, his boots echoing on the wood floor. He pulled another log from the bin and placed it on the fire, sparks jumping in the sudden rush of heat. "You can stay here tonight," he said, keeping his back to her. "Ain't much company to be had, but you'll be safe. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Lila nodded, her shoulders easing for the first time since she'd entered the house. "Thank you, Mr. McCrae." He turned, his eyes softening. "Just Daniel do." She smiled faintly, a small, fragile thing, and drew the blanket tighter around herself. For a long while they sat in silence, the only sound the hiss of snow against the windows and the steady rhythm of the flames. Daniel found himself wondering who'd let a girl like her slip through the cracks of this world too many folks had, he reckoned, himself included. He thought of his late wife, Clara, and how she used to say kindness cost nothing but could save a soul. He hadn't believed her then, but watching Lila's eyes flicker with the light of the fire, he started to think maybe Clara had been right. He rose after a time, fetched another quilt from the closet, and draped it gently over her shoulders. She murmured something soft, maybe a thank you, maybe a prayer, and within minutes her head tilted, sleep pulling her under. Daniel stood there, staring at the girl sleeping by his hearth, her face half hidden by shadow and flame. Outside, the storm howled across the open plains, but in that room, warmth lingered. For the first time in years, Daniel McCrae didn't feel quite so alone, and as he gazed into the fire, he wondered if fate had brought the girl to his door for her sake or his. The wind clawed at the windows, a relentless chorus that made the old house creak like it was alive. But inside, the fire glowed steady, painting the room in soft gold. Daniel sat opposite Lila, the flames between them flickering over faces both worn by different kinds of sorrow. For a long stretch of silence, he just listened to the storm and the sound of her breathing, the way it came slow now, calm, like she'd finally found rest. But the quiet pressed on him, and the memories came creeping in, same as they always did this time of year. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the firelight catching in his eyes. "Used to be this house was full of laughter come Christmas," he said, his voice gravel, soft. "My boy, Tommy, he'd wake before dawn just to catch a glimpse of the tree lights. And Clara, my wife, she'd have cocoa on the stove before the first snow even touched the ground." He paused, a bitter smile tugging at his mouth, the kind that never reached his eyes. "That was before the fever took 'em both. 2 winters ago. House has been quiet ever since. Too damn quiet. The words hung there, heavy as the snow on the eaves. Lila shifted closer, her blanket trailing along the floorboards, her face pale but her eyes steady. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said softly. "No one should have to spend Christmas with ghosts." He gave a faint, humorless chuckle. "Ghosts are all I got left, seems like. Every time the wind blows, I swear I hear Clara humming from the kitchen. Sometimes I almost answer." The fire cracked, and for a moment, neither spoke. The smell of wood smoke and old pine filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of broth from her bowl. "Maybe they ain't gone," Lila whispered after a while. "Maybe they just want you to remember the good parts, not the pain." Daniel looked at her, really looked, seeing the wear in her eyes, the kind that came from a life that had already asked too much. "You sound older than you look," he said. She smiled faintly, staring into the flames. "Hard winters'll do that." He nodded, understanding more than he said. "Guess you and me both been walking through cold a long time." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far across the plains, the storm's heart moving closer. Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee, the steam rising like the breath of the house itself, alive again after too long dead. He handed her one, his hand brushing hers, rough against her small, frost-chapped fingers. "To ghosts," he murmured. "To second chances," she added, and they drank, neither breaking the gaze that lingered between them. The fire snapped again, and for the first time in years, the old parlor felt lived in like laughter might one day echo there again. Daniel leaned back, the weight in his chest easing, and realized that for all the wealth he had, this quiet moment with a stranger by the fire was the richest thing he'd known in a long, long while. Morning crept into the ranch slow and silver, the kind of dawn that carried the hush of snow still falling beyond the windows. Daniel had been up before the light, tending the fire and feeding the horses in the barn, his breath hanging white in the air. When he came back inside, the scent of coffee filled the kitchen, and Lila stood at the table, her hair loose around her shoulders, sleeves rolled to the elbow as she carefully set down 2 plates. It was the first time he'd seen her in the daylight, and the warmth of the firelight hadn't hidden the truth the way it had the night before. Her hands small, trembling, covered in old scars and fresh blisters caught his eye. They were the hands of someone who'd worked hard for little and been paid even less. "You don't have to do that," he said, nodding toward the dishes. She startled, nearly dropping a plate before catching it to her chest, eyes darting toward him like a cornered animal. "It's no trouble," she whispered. But when he stepped closer, the morning light caught the raw skin across her knuckles, and she pulled the sleeves down quick, hiding them beneath the frayed wool of her sweater. Daniel stopped short, not wanting to scare her. "Those marks," he said gently. "You hurt yourself?" Her eyes dropped to the table. "Just workin' is all." "Workin' where?" The pause that followed was long, filled only by the hiss of the fire and the faint whine of wind pushing at the door. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost too quiet to hear. "The mill outside Carson," she said. "They let us go before the freeze came, said we weren't needed anymore." Daniel's brow furrowed. He knew that place, the old textile mill near the river bend. They'd been cutting wages and turning folks out for months, leaving half the valley hungry before Christmas. He'd ridden past it not long ago, seen the smoke from their chimneys gone cold. "How long you been on your own?" he asked. She hesitated, her lips pressing tight, then sighed. "Since September, I guess. Been taking odd jobs, laundry, cooking, whatever I could. When the snow came, folks stopped needing hands, or stopped paying for 'em." She tried to smile then, a brave little thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Guess I just kept moving till I couldn't." Daniel's gut twisted. He'd known hunger once, long ago, but not like that, not the kind that carved hollows behind your eyes and made every step feel like a sin against your own body. "You should have come to town," he said quietly. "There's help to be had." She shook her head, setting down the last plate with trembling fingers. "Help comes with strings, Mr. McCrae. I done had enough of those." He understood then the way she'd flinched at kindness, the way she looked at the door like she half expected to be thrown out any minute. She wasn't just poor. She'd been used, discarded, made to believe she was worth less than the work she gave. Daniel looked at her hands again, folded tight in her lap now, and felt something heavy settle in his chest, a mix of sorrow and guilt, and something fierce that felt like resolve. "You ain't alone anymore, Lila," he said, his voice low but sure. "Not while you're under my roof." For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't look afraid, just tired and maybe, just maybe, a little bit safe. Snow had drifted knee-deep by the time Daniel reached Dry Creek, his horse's hooves crunching through the frozen ruts of Main Street. The town was quiet but for the sound of wind scraping along the rooftops, carrying the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer from somewhere down the lane. Most stores were shuttered for Christmas, but the Mercantile stood open, lamplight flickering through the frost-rimmed windows. Daniel tied his reins to the hitching post and stepped inside, the warmth hitting him like a sigh. The bell over the door gave a sharp jingle, drawing the attention of the clerk, a thin, sharp-faced man named Howell, who'd made a living selling thread and gossip in equal measure. "Well, look what the storm blew in," Howell said, leaning on the counter. "Didn't think the great Daniel McCrae left his fancy ranch for nothing less than business these days." Daniel ignored him, moving toward the rack of women's shawls. He picked one up, a soft woolen piece dyed deep red, warm but simple, the kind Clara would have admired once. "How much?" he asked. Howell's eyes narrowed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Ain't like you to be buying ladies' things this close to Christmas. Word is you've got company up there in that big empty house of yours. Some girl, they say. You rescuing strays now, McCrae?" The air between them went still. Daniel's jaw set like stone, and when he turned, his eyes burned cold. "You mind your tongue, Howell," he said, voice low and steady. "Ain't fit for a man to judge what he don't understand." The clerk swallowed hard, his grin faltering. Without another word, Daniel laid down the money, tucked the shawl beneath his arm, and strode out into the biting wind. The ride home was long and silent, the horizon nothing but white and sky. He thought of the girl waiting by the fire, her small hands folded in her lap, the way she'd thanked him for broth like it was gold. He didn't know what drew him to her kindness so fiercely. Maybe it was Clara's ghost whispering through the snow, or maybe it was just the part of him that still remembered what it was to be lost. When he reached the ranch, dusk had fallen, the windows glowing soft against the storm. Inside, Lila was tending the fire, her hair catching the light like spun copper. She turned when the door opened, startled at first, then smiling shyly when she saw him. "You were gone long," she said, her voice hesitant. Daniel shrugged out of his coat, brushing snow from the shoulders, then reached into the saddlebag he carried. "Had business in town," he said. "Got something for you." He held out the bundle, and when she unfolded the red shawl, her breath caught. Her fingers traced the edge of the fabric as if it were something sacred. "For me?" she whispered. "Ain't nobody ever bought me something pretty." Daniel smiled faintly, a warmth stirring behind his eyes. "Then it's about time someone did." Lila pressed the shawl to her chest, and for a moment, the firelight painted her face in color again. She looked softer, younger, almost unburdened. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the ranch, a strange peace took hold. Daniel turned to hang his coat by the door, pretending not to see the tears that shimmered in her eyes, nor the small smile that broke through them. And though he told himself it was just kindness, something deeper moved quietly in his chest. Something he hadn't felt since the day the laughter left this house, a flicker of life returning, like spring daring to bloom beneath the snow. The wind had eased by nightfall, leaving the world outside blanketed in silence, the kind that swallows sound and time alike. Inside the ranch house, the fire still burned steady, its glow casting long, gentle shadows that danced along the walls. Daniel sat at his desk near the parlor window, an untouched glass of whiskey beside him, ledger open though he hadn't read a word in an hour. His thoughts wandered like ghosts, his wife's laughter echoing faintly in the corners, his son's small boots pattering down the hall, and just when the ache of memory started to thicken behind his ribs, a sound drifted through the air so soft it almost seemed imagined. Lila's voice, humming low, tender, fragile as snowfall. It wasn't words, not at first, just a melody, weaving through the house like smoke, sweet and mournful. Daniel froze, his pen still in his hand. The tune curled around him, each note tugging at something deep inside, something he thought had long since gone to dust. He rose slowly, drawn toward the sound, heart beating heavier with every step. In the kitchen doorway, he stopped. Lila stood by the hearth, the red shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hands busy folding linens that hadn't been touched since Clara's time. The song spilled from her lips in a whisper. The same melody Clara had sung every Christmas Eve after Tommy fell asleep, the lullaby she said kept angels close. "Where'd you learn that?" Daniel's voice came out rough, catching her off guard. She turned, startled, color draining from her face. I'm sorry," she stammered, setting the linens down. "Didn't mean to bother you." "No," he said, stepping closer, the floorboards groaning under his boots. "That song, my wife used to sing it, every Christmas." Lila's eyes softened, confusion mingling with sorrow. "My mama sang it too," she said quietly. Said it was an old hymn she learned from her folks. She used to hum it when she prayed. Back, when things weren't so hard. Daniel's breath left him slow, heavy. For a long moment neither spoke. The fire cracked between them, throwing sparks that faded before they hit the ground. The melody still lingered in the air, faint but unbroken, like a bridge between past and present. "Ain't heard it in years," he murmured, his voice barely above the whisper of the flames. "Guess I never thought I would again." Lila looked down, twisting the corner of the shawl in her hands. "Funny how songs find their way back," she said. "Maybe the good ones don't ever really leave us." Daniel's gaze lingered on her, the flicker of light painting her in warmth that wasn't just from the fire. She looked fragile still, but not broken, like someone learning to stand again after too many winters of falling. "Maybe you're right," he said, though his throat felt tight. "Maybe they don't." She smiled then, small but real, and went back to folding the linens, humming once more. Daniel turned to the window, looking out at the snow. But his reflection caught his eye, the lines on his face, the grief carved deep, and yet behind it, something new, something stirring. It wasn't the song that had changed the air, it was her. That girl with nothing, humming hope into a house that had forgotten what it was to live. And as her voice carried softly through the room, Daniel McCrae realized the cold that had gripped his heart for 2 long years was beginning, at last, to melt. For 3 long days the snow fell thick and steady, smothering the ranch beneath a white stillness that blurred the world into silence. The wind died down at last, leaving behind drifts that climbed the fence posts and sealed the barn doors shut. But inside the house, life had begun to stir again. Lila moved softly through the rooms that had once echoed with emptiness, her small frame wrapped in the red shawl as she swept the hearth, scrubbed the counters, and cooked what little they had left in the pantry. The scent of stew and rising bread soon replaced the chill of dust and disuse, curling through the air like a promise. Daniel watched her work, half from the chair by the fire, half from the quiet awe of a man rediscovering something long lost. She hummed while she worked, that same tune that had haunted his dreams, and with every note the old house seemed to breathe a little deeper, as if the walls themselves remembered laughter. One evening, while the storm raged unseen beyond the frosted windows, Daniel found himself telling her stories, small things. At first, how his horse was too stubborn for its own good, how the ranch hands once painted the barn door pink on a dare, how Tommy had once built a snowman taller than he was and refused to let it melt. Lila laughed softly at that, her eyes bright, and before Daniel knew it, he was laughing too, a deep, full laugh that startled him with its own sound. He hadn't laughed since Clara's funeral, not like that. The noise felt strange and new, like sunlight in winter. When he caught his breath, he found Lila watching him, smiling through the firelight. "You've turned this house back into a home," he said quietly, almost ashamed of the emotion that crept into his voice. Her smile faltered, just a little, and she shook her head. "Didn't mean to," she said. "Just didn't want to feel useless anymore." The words hung in the air, tender and raw, and something in Daniel's chest tightened. "You're far from useless," he said, leaning forward. "This place was dead quiet before you came along. Now it feels different." She looked down, cheeks flushed pink from the fire's warmth. "Guess maybe I needed a place that'd let me feel alive again, too." For a while neither spoke, content to listen to the wood crackle and the wind sigh faintly against the eaves. The light from the fire wrapped around them, soft and golden, and the house no longer felt like a tomb for the past, it felt like something reborn. Later that night, Daniel found her asleep in the armchair by the fire, the red shawl draped around her like a flame. The stew pot simmered low, filling the room with warmth, and a gentle peace settled over him. He fetched a quilt from the hall closet, careful not to wake her, and laid it across her shoulders. For a long time, he just stood there, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing and the faint whisper of the storm outside. The old ache of grief was still there, but softer now, dulled by something he hadn't felt in years' comfort. As he turned down the lamp, Daniel McCrae realized the snow might have trapped them inside, but Lila's presence had freed something in him far more bound, the simple, forgotten truth that even in the coldest winter, warmth can find its way home. The knock came just after dawn, sharp and cold as a rifle crack against the door. Daniel had been stoking the fire, coaxing the coals back to life, when the sound froze him in place. Outside, the wind had stilled and the world lay buried under a hush of snow so deep it muffled even the sound of horses. Yet somehow, the steady thud of a gloved fist carried like thunder through the house. Lila startled awake on the settee, her red shawl slipping from her shoulders. Daniel gave her a quiet look, steady, reassuring, and went to the door. When he opened it, the cold bit hard, and there stood Sheriff Cal Rourke, his coat dusted white, his hat pulled low against the light. He wasn't a man prone to pleasantries. "Mornin', McCrae," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Mind if I come in?" Daniel stepped aside, already uneasy. "What's this about, Sheriff?" Cal brushed the snow from his sleeves, eyes scanning the warm interior, the fire, the table set for two, the faint smell of coffee that hung in the air. "Heard talk you've got company out here," he said finally, reaching into his coat. "A young woman." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You heard right. She was near froze when I found her." "What of it?" The sheriff pulled out a folded sheet of paper, creased and damp at the edges. "Got word from Carson. Mill foreman posted this 2 days ago." He held it out, and Daniel took it, the firelight catching on the black ink, a name, a sketch, and the word "Runaway" stamped across the bottom. Lila Mae Turner. His stomach sank. "She's listed as bound by indenture to the Carson textile mill," Cal continued, his tone flat. "Ran off last month. Took a week's pay with her. Her overseer claims she owes debt for room and board. He's asking she be returned." Daniel's fingers tightened on the paper. The word "bought" caught his eye near the bottom. "Bought her contract," the notice said, "like a man might buy a mule or a wagon." He looked up, slowly, his voice quiet but laced with iron. "Bought her?" he repeated. "You telling me someone thinks they own that girl?" The sheriff's expression flickered regret, maybe, or just discomfort, but his tone stayed measured. "That's the law, Daniel. Mill debt's legal property in Carson County. You know how it works." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes burning like banked coals. "I know what it is," he said. "And I know it's wrong." Behind him, he could feel Lila's fear thickening the air. She stood just out of sight, clutching the edge of the shawl like a lifeline. "Sheriff," he went on, quieter now, "that girl's worked herself near to death. You can see it plain as day. If the mill wants her back, they can come here themselves and try to take her." Cal's jaw tightened. "You're treading dangerous ground, friend. You start harboring runaways. It won't sit well with folks in town. You could lose more than reputation if they call it abetting theft of property." Daniel's stare didn't waver. "She ain't property." The words came like a vow, low and certain, echoing through the old timbered room. The sheriff studied him a moment longer, then sighed, adjusting his hat. "I'll pretend I didn't see her for now. But if word gets out, I'll have no choice." He turned toward the door, his boots crunching on the wood floor. "Be smart, Daniel. The world don't take kindly to folks who stand between money and its due." When the door closed behind him, the silence felt heavier than before. Daniel looked down at the crumpled poster in his hand, then toward the girl by the fire. Her eyes shimmered with fear and shame, but beneath it all, there was something else, a fragile trust. Daniel dropped the paper into the flames, watching the edges curl and blacken until her name was nothing but ash. "You're safe here," he said softly, voice steady despite the storm rising outside and within. The storm had quieted into a soft whisper by nightfall, the snow outside lying still and silver beneath a cold moon. Inside, The ranch slept in the hush of late hours. The fire burned low, and yet Daniel couldn't rest. He sat by the hearth, staring into the dying embers, his thoughts turning over like restless coals. Leela's frightened eyes, the sheriff's warning, the ugly word bought echoing in his skull. He'd seen what men became when they believed another soul could be owned. He'd fought those kinds once, in another life, and thought he'd left that battle behind. But as the wind sighed against the windows, a faint rustle pulled him from his thoughts. Down the hall, the sound of movement, soft steps, cautious, and the creak of a hinge. He rose quietly, following the sound to the front room where Lila stood by the door, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, a small bundle clutched to her chest. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "I didn't mean to wake you," she whispered. "You didn't," he said, though his voice was low, rough from hours of silence. "Where you think you're going?" She looked away, toward the window frosted white with snow. "I can't stay, Daniel. Sheriff will come back, and when he does, he'll bring men with him. I won't be the reason folks start whispering your name like it's dirt." She swallowed, her voice breaking. "You've been good to me, better than anyone's ever been, but I won't bring you trouble." Daniel took a slow step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "You think I'd trade your life for my name?" he asked quietly. Lila shook her head, tears glinting in the firelight. "You don't understand. Men like that foreman, they don't forget. They'll make it their business to ruin anyone who helps me." "Then let 'em try." He stopped in front of her, tall and steady, his shadow stretching across the floor. "You've been running from men who think fear gives them power. I won't let that kind of man win. Not again." His voice had gone soft but sure, carrying something deeper than defiance, conviction, the kind that didn't need raising to be heard. He reached past her and opened the door, the cold air sweeping in like a blade, stinging the warmth from the room. "If they want to come for you," he said, his hand braced on the frame, "they'll have to go through me first." Lila stood frozen, her bundle trembling in her hands, her breath catching in the frosty air. "Why?" she asked at last, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why would you risk it? For me?" Daniel looked at her then, really looked, saw the scars on her hands, the fear in her eyes, the stubborn flicker of hope she still carried despite everything the world had taken from her. And in her face, he saw the reflection of all he'd lost and the chance to do something that mattered again. His gaze softened, and a faint smile touched his lips. "Because it's Christmas," he said simply, "and I remember what it means now." For a moment neither moved, the silence between them as fragile as glass. Then Lila's bundle slipped from her fingers, falling soundlessly to the floor. She stepped forward, the tears she'd been holding back finally spilling free, and before he could speak, she threw her arms around him. He stood still for a heartbeat, then wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as the cold wind howled outside. The fire behind them flickered back to life, brightening the room with a warm, steady glow. And in that quiet embrace, in a house once haunted by loss, Daniel McCrae found the truest kind of redemption, the kind born not from wealth or prayer, but from the simple, fierce act of choosing to care. The morning broke gray and heavy, the air so cold it bit through wool and bone alike. The storm had passed, but the world outside lay silent beneath a sky, the color of pewter, the snow untouched except for the thin trail of tracks winding up from the main road. Daniel had seen them long before the riders reached the ranch, 5 of them, their silhouettes dark against the white horizon, horses steaming, rifles glinting faintly in the pale light. He'd known this reckoning would come. Men like the mill owner never let go of what they thought they owned. By the time the lead rider reined in at the porch, Daniel was already waiting, coat collar turned up against the cold, a double-barreled shotgun resting easy in his hands. The mill owner, a fleshy man with a fur collar and a smugness that money bought cheap, dismounted with effort, his boots sinking deep into the snow. "McCrae," he called, voice dripping false courtesy. "Heard you've got something that belongs to me." Daniel didn't move, the wind tugging at his coat, his gaze hard as the frost. "Ain't a thing on this land that belongs to you," he said flatly. The man's jaw tightened, his gloved hand twitching near the pistol at his side. "You got a runaway under your roof. Name of Lila Turner. She signed contract with my mill, still owes 6 months' labor. You're harboring stolen property." Daniel's eyes narrowed. Property, he repeated, the word tasting like ash. That what you call a girl working herself half to death for scraps? That's the law, the man snapped. I paid good money for her indenture. She runs. That's theft. Daniel took one step down from the porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots. You'll leave this land, he said, voice low but sharp as a blade. Now. One of the hired guns shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his holster. But Daniel cocked the shotgun with a clean, heavy click that cut through the still air, like thunder. Try me, he said, his voice carrying across the snow, and I'll see to it the buzzards get fat before nightfall. The mill owner froze, eyes darting between the barrel aimed steady at his chest and the cold, unyielding stare of the man holding it. Behind him, his riders exchanged uneasy glances. The silence stretched thin as glass until, finally, the owner spat into the snow, his pride stinging worse than the wind. You'll regret this, McCrae, he hissed, mounting his horse. You think one act of charity makes you righteous? You're crossing the wrong kind of men. Daniel's expression didn't change. You send anyone after her again, he said evenly. And I'll ride to Carson myself. Then you'll learn what kind of man you're crossing. The threat hung in the air, cold and certain, and for once, the mill owner seemed to believe it. With a sharp tug of the reins, he turned his horse, and the others followed, their figures shrinking against the endless white until they vanished over the ridge. Daniel stood there for a long time, breath clouding the air, the echo of hoofbeats fading into silence. Inside, Lila watched from the window, her hands trembling around the shawl pulled tight to her chest. She'd seen men like that before, cruelty cloaked in power, and never once had anyone stood between her and them. Now she watched the man who had, standing tall against the gray sky like something carved out of the earth itself. When Daniel finally turned back toward the house, his eyes met hers through the glass. She tried to smile, but her lip quivered, tears slipping free instead. He gave a single nod, no words, no grand gesture, just a promise in his gaze that said, "You're safe now." And though fear still lingered in her heart, so did something stronger. The quiet, aching certainty that for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in the fight. Morning came soft and golden, the first true light in days spilling across the snow like a blessing. The storm had finally passed, leaving the ranch wrapped in a hush so deep it felt sacred, the air crisp and clean beneath a pale blue sky. Daniel rose early, as he always did. But this morning something tugged at him different, an urge, quiet and sure, that pulled him toward the line of pines behind the barn. He trudged through the snow, breath clouding before him, until he found a small, crooked tree leaning against the drift, its branches sparse but strong. It wasn't much to look at, but somehow it felt right, humble and stubborn, just like the both of them. He cut it free, slung it over his shoulder, and carried it back toward the house. Lila was by the hearth when he came in, still wrapped in her red shawl, humming softly as she stirred the morning coffee. Her eyes widened when she saw him shake the snow from the little tree. "What in the world?" She started, a laugh, slipping through her surprise. Daniel set it down near the fire, the needles catching the warmth and releasing the faint scent of pine. "Never got around to one," he said with a shrug, his voice softer than usual. "Figured maybe it's time." For a moment she just stared at it, her expression shifting from disbelief to something close to wonder. Then, without a word, she went to fetch what little they had, a length of faded red ribbon, a handful of buttons, scraps of twine. Together they decorated the crooked tree, her small fingers tying the ribbons while Daniel fashioned a rough star out of tin from an old coffee lid. When they finished, the firelight danced off their makeshift ornaments, turning that humble pine into something near beautiful. "It's perfect," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at her, the way her eyes shone with quiet joy, and found himself smiling before he even realized it. "It'll do," he murmured, though the truth was, it did more than that. It made the house feel alive in a way he hadn't thought possible again. They sat side by side on the rug, watching the fire and the flicker of light through the branches. Outside, the snow glittered untouched, and from somewhere far off, faint but clear, the church bells of Dry Creek began to ring, the first time he'd heard them since the Christmas before Clara and Tommy passed. The sound filled the air like a prayer answered late but not forgotten. Lila leaned closer, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, and whispered, "You saved me, Daniel." He turned to her, eyes soft with something too deep for words, and shook his head gently. "No, Lila," he said. "You saved me." For a long while neither spoke. The fire crackled, the bells kept ringing, and the warmth between them felt like the world itself had started to thaw. Outside, the sun rose over the snowbound plains, spilling light across the roof and catching on the frost that hung like diamonds from the eaves. Inside, laughter quiet, hesitant, and real echoed through the house for the first time in years. And as the bells carried through the clear winter air, Daniel McCrae understood what Christmas truly meant. Not the gifts or the hymns or the feast long past, but the mercy of finding another heart still willing to believe in goodness, even after all the cold the world could bring.